What happens when the very person meant to protect you becomes your greatest threat? Imagine a man who swore to protect his community, a sheriff, entrusted with the power to uphold the law, turning into a cold-blooded killer. The very same man who stood tall in uniform, the face of justice in a small town, becomes the villain in a horrifying real-life tragedy. But this isn't some fictional crime drama. This is a real story, a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about power, respect, and the terrifying line between control and violence. How far can authority corrupt? How can a man, once respected, fall so far? When the sheriff's power is challenged, is it so easy to break the law he swore to enforce? When an argument turns into a tragedy, can we still call it a crime of passion, or is there something darker at play? Today, we delve deep into the shocking downfall of a man who could have been the town's hero. Instead, he became the face of betrayal, manipulation, and ultimately, murder. Stay tuned, because this case will make you rethink the real cost of unchecked power. What happens when the person who is supposed to protect you becomes the one who destroys you? This is the story of Sheriff Malik Daniels, and the deadly consequences of ego, control, and humiliation. Are you ready to face the ugly truth behind the badge? Let's begin. Before Sheriff Malik Daniels became the towering figure of Willowcrest, he was just a boy in the backwoods of South Carolina, a boy raised on tales of discipline, order, and an unyielding sense of right and wrong. His father, Isaiah Daniels, was a stern man, a military veteran whose rules governed the family like a second Bible. Isaiah believed that weakness invited chaos, and his parenting reflected that belief. Malik grew up learning that control was strength, that bending others to your will was not just a skill but a necessity. But there was another side to his upbringing. His mother, Delilah, was the counterbalance, a warm, nurturing woman who tried to instill love where her husband instilled fear. She'd hold Malik close, telling him stories of leaders who protected their people, who fought for justice not with force but with compassion. These moments shaped a young Malik, planting seeds of ambition and a desire for power. Yet, the contradictions in his upbringing, love intertwined with control, would define the man he would become. As a teenager, Malik's charisma began to bloom. He was the captain of the football team, the star debater, the young man everyone wanted to follow. Teachers praised him, classmates envied him, and authority figures saw in him the potential for greatness. But beneath the accolades, there was a hunger, a need to prove himself, to dominate any room he entered. That hunger followed him to the police academy, where Malik quickly rose through the ranks. He was relentless, driven not just by a desire to serve but by an unshakable belief that he was destined to lead. By the time he was elected sheriff of Willowcrest, Malik Daniels wasn't just an officer, he was the embodiment of authority. The people of Willowcrest trusted him implicitly, seeing him as a man who could keep their town safe from the chaos of the outside world. But power changes people, and Malik was no exception. With the badge came respect, and with respect came influence. Soon, influence became control, and control became an addiction. Rumors began to circulate about the sheriff's methods, arrests made without warrants, dissenters silenced with intimidation, and an unwavering demand for loyalty. For some, these were mere whispers, dismissed as the price of effective leadership. But for others, they were the first signs that the man who vowed to protect Willowcrest was using his power for himself. His arrogance grew, his decisions became more erratic, and the lines between justice and control blurred. Yet, to the town, Malik Daniels remained a hero, his flaws hidden behind a polished image of duty and discipline. At the heart of Malik's life was his wife, Soraya Daniels. Their meeting was the stuff of romance, two young souls colliding at a charity event, their connection instant and undeniable. Soraya, with her bright eyes and infectious laughter, was everything Malik admired. She was ambitious, compassionate, and full of dreams, a stark contrast to his commanding presence. Their courtship was a whirlwind. Friends described it as a love story written in the stars. Malik, ever the charmer, made grand gestures, a surprise proposal beneath the town's oldest oak tree, promises of a life filled with love and security. For a time, it seemed they had found in each other what every couple dreams of, a partner to share life's burdens and joys. But the dynamic shifted once the vows were exchanged. As Malik's career soared, Soraya found herself adapting to a life overshadowed by her husband's growing power. She loved him deeply, but the man she had married was changing. The once tender and attentive partner began to exhibit a need for control that extended into their marriage. Soraya, ever the optimist, tried to focus on the positives. She poured her energy into her career as an elementary school teacher and into preparing for the arrival of their first child. Pregnancy brought her hope, a belief that the baby would bring them closer, that Malik would find his way back to the man she fell in love with. But as her belly grew, so did her fears. Malik's temper flared more often, his demands became more unreasonable, and his once loving gaze turned into something harder, more scrutinizing. Soraya confided in close friends, describing moments that left her questioning her safety. Yet, she never fully shared the extent of her fear. After all, how could she? He wasn't just her husband, he was the sheriff, a man whose power extended far beyond their home. Their relationship was a paradox. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple, graceful at galas, affectionate at church, the picture of unity. But behind closed doors, their marriage was a battleground. Malik's control extended to every aspect of Soraya's life, from the friends she could see to the way she spent her evenings. Flashbacks paint a stark contrast, moments of joy, like the time they painted the nursery together, laughing as they argued over colors. Moments of tenderness, like the night Malik rested his hand on her belly, speaking softly to their unborn child. These glimpses of the man she loved kept Soraya hopeful. But those moments were fleeting, overshadowed by the growing tension between them. Arguments became a regular occurrence, and Soraya's once vibrant spirit dimmed. Friends noticed her withdrawal, the way her laughter no longer reached her eyes, the guarded way she spoke about her marriage. Soraya's pregnancy should have been a time of celebration, a chapter filled with love and anticipation. Instead, it became a chapter marked by fear and uncertainty. As the due date approached, Soraya found herself asking questions no expectant mother should have to ask. Would her child grow up in a home filled with love? Or would the shadow of Malik's control consume them both? To understand how a man once hailed as a hero could commit an act so heinous, we must explore the complexities of his relationship with Soraya, a relationship that began in love but ended in unimaginable tragedy. It began like any other day in Willowcrest, where life followed a familiar rhythm. Sheriff Malik Daniels rose before dawn, as he always did, to the sound of his alarm clock, a shrill, unyielding reminder of the responsibilities that awaited him. His routine was predictable, a black coffee brewed strong enough to stand a spoon, a quick skim through the morning news, and a cursory kiss on Soraya's forehead as she stirred in their bed. Outside, the sun painted the town in warm hues of amber and gold, promising another idyllic day, or so it seemed. Soraya, nearing the final weeks of her pregnancy, was already busy preparing for the town's annual charity luncheon. This event had been a staple in their lives for years, a showcase of Willowcrest's sense of community and the Daniels' role as its cornerstone. To the town, Malik was the ever-reliable sheriff, the protector of their peace. Soraya, radiant and poised, was his equal, graceful and supportive, the perfect partner in every way. But beneath the veneer of harmony, fissures had begun to form. That morning, as Soraya ironed Malik's uniform, the tension was already brewing. He had snapped at her for something trivial, a misplaced badge or a forgotten detail about the luncheon. She'd bitten her tongue, a reflex born of years of navigating his temper. Today was not the day for arguments, she told herself. But destiny, as they say, had other plans. By noon, the luncheon was in full swing, a picture-perfect gathering of Willowcrest's elite. Tables adorned with white linen cloths stretched across the town hall, glittering under the soft glow of string lights. The scent of roasted chicken and freshly baked bread mingled with the chatter of cheerful guests. Malik arrived with his characteristic swagger, his polished badge glinting under the midday sun. Soraya followed closely behind, her every movement exuding a quiet elegance that drew approving glances from onlookers. Malik, as always, commanded the room. Stationed among his deputies and longtime colleagues, he launched into stories of past triumphs, punctuating each tale with his signature laugh. Soraya, seated a few feet away, smiled politely as she watched him bask in the admiration of the crowd. But then it happened, a moment so small, so seemingly inconsequential, yet catastrophic in its aftermath. Malik, mid-story, had made a comment, a boastful embellishment of some long-forgotten event. Soraya, perhaps out of habit or fatigue, interjected. "That's not quite how it happened, Malik," she said, her voice light yet firm. "You said it was Deputy Harris who solved that case, didn't you?" A hush fell over the table. Malik froze, his jaw tightening as he turned to her, his expression betraying the storm that brewed behind his forced smile. She hadn't meant to humiliate him, at least, not intentionally. But her words hung in the air, a challenge to his authority, his credibility. To Malik, it wasn't just an interruption, it was an affront, a public undermining of the respect he demanded, not just as a man but as the sheriff of Willowcrest. He tried to recover, laughing it off with a curt remark, but the damage was done. The glances exchanged among his colleagues, the subtle shifts in their postures, were enough to ignite a fire of resentment within him. Soraya, sensing the shift, fell silent. She knew that look, that simmering anger that bubbled just beneath the surface. The rest of the luncheon passed in a blur. Malik, though outwardly composed, was seething. Every laugh, every glance exchanged at the table felt like a dagger to his pride. To him, Soraya's correction wasn't just a comment, it was an act of defiance, a reminder of the cracks in his carefully constructed world. By the time they left the event, the tension between them was thick enough to cut with a knife. In the car, Malik was silent, his hands gripping the steering wheel with a force that made his knuckles white. Soraya sat quietly beside him, her fingers resting protectively on her swollen belly. She wanted to apologize, to diffuse the tension, but her instincts told her it would only make things worse. The confrontation escalated the moment they stepped through the door of their home. Malik slammed the front door shut, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. "What were you thinking?" he spat, his voice low but laced with venom. Soraya, exhausted and emotionally drained, tried to explain. "I didn't mean to embarrass you, Malik. I was just trying to what?" he interrupted, his voice rising. "Make me look like a fool? Undermine me in front of my colleagues? Do you have any idea what you've done?" The argument spiraled quickly, each word sharper than the last. Malik paced the living room like a caged animal, his anger consuming him. Soraya, tears streaming down her face, pleaded with him to calm down. "Malik, please. This isn't good for the baby." But reason had no place here. In his eyes, she was no longer his wife, his partner. She was an adversary, someone who had dared to challenge his authority. In a moment of blind fury, Malik grabbed a decorative vase from the table and hurled it against the wall, the shattering sound startling them both into silence. For a brief moment, there was calm. Soraya took a step back, her hand clutching her belly as she tried to steady her breathing. "Malik," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, let's talk about this later. I need to rest." But Malik was beyond reason. The room, once a sanctuary of their shared life, now felt like a battleground. And then, in an instant that would change everything, he crossed a line he could never uncross. "You dare not walk out on me when I'm speaking to you." Malik's rage, which had been simmering throughout the day, boiled over completely. His mind, clouded by a mix of humiliation and fury, drove him to a moment of uncontrollable violence. As Soraya stood before him, pleading for calm, her words became distorted in his mind, less an olive branch and more a continuation of the perceived attack on his authority. It began with a shove. Malik, in a moment of frustration, pushed her back with enough force to make her stumble. Soraya, her hand instinctively protecting her swollen belly, gasped in fear. "Stop, Malik. Please, think of the baby," she cried out. But her words, intended to bring him back to reason, only seemed to inflame him further. To Malik, her plea was yet another reminder of the growing distance between them, the life that was supposed to bring them together now symbolizing his inadequacies as a husband and a man. The argument escalated rapidly. Malik grabbed the nearest object, a heavy brass lamp from the side table, and brandished it in anger. "You don't get to talk to me like that," he roared, his voice shaking the walls. Soraya took a step back, her eyes wide with terror. She tried to retreat further, but there was nowhere to go. The living room, once a haven of family moments and shared laughter, became a cage trapping her with her enraged husband. In his blind fury, Malik swung the lamp. The sharp crack of the metal meeting Soraya's temple echoed in the room like thunder. She collapsed immediately, crumpling to the ground as blood began to pool beneath her. The room fell silent except for Malik's ragged breathing, his eyes fixed on what he had done. The rage that had consumed him moments before now gave way to cold, horrifying clarity. Soraya lay motionless, her body unnaturally still. Her hand, once protectively cradling her stomach, now rested limply at her side. The only sound in the house was the faint hum of the refrigerator, a cruel reminder of the ordinary day that had turned into this nightmare. He fell to his knees beside her, his hands shaking as he reached out, muttering, "No. No, no, no. Soraya, wake up. Please wake up." But there was no response, no movement. Her face, once filled with life and love, was now pale and lifeless. Panic set in. Malik stumbled to his feet, pacing the room as he tried to process what had happened. He was the sheriff, the man who enforced the law, and now he had broken it in the most unforgivable way. He glanced out the window, his eyes darting toward the neighboring houses. Had anyone heard? Did they know? He considered calling for help but quickly dismissed the idea. How could he explain this? How could he face his colleagues, his town, and admit that the man they trusted had become a monster? Instead, Malik did the unthinkable. He began to stage the scene, hoping to fabricate a story that would absolve him of blame. He moved objects around the room, creating signs of a supposed break-in. He wiped down the lamp, erasing his fingerprints, and placed it back on the table. But no matter how much he rearranged the evidence, he couldn't erase the truth. The blood, the lifeless body of his wife, and the silence of the unborn child she carried were damning enough. As the hours ticked by, Malik's panic gave way to a cold, calculated resolve. He rehearsed his story, convincing himself of the lies he would tell. But deep down, he knew that no amount of deceit could undo what he had done. Malik Daniels, the sheriff of Willowcrest, had crossed a line that no badge or authority could ever excuse. The quiet of Willowcrest was shattered when Soraya's body was discovered. It was a neighbor, Ms. Etta Palmer, who first raised the alarm. She had been the one who faintly heard the commotion the night before, muffled shouting, a thud, then silence. Ms. Palmer dismissed it initially, thinking it was another marital spat, but as the sun rose, the absence of activity from the Daniels household grew troubling. By mid-morning, she made the call that brought officers to the scene. Malik, true to his training, had carefully staged the house. Broken glass lay scattered by the back door, hinting at a forced entry. Furniture was overturned as though a violent intruder had ransacked the home. Malik himself had dialed into the narrative, feigning shock and grief when his colleagues arrived. His voice cracked as he explained his fabricated story of a burglary gone wrong, his demeanor oscillating between fury at the imaginary assailant and heartbreak over his wife's death. The responding officers were initially inclined to believe him. After all, Malik Daniels was one of their own, a man respected, even feared, in some circles. But as they surveyed the scene, something about the setup didn't sit right. The break-in seemed too staged, too convenient. Whispers among the officers hinted at unease. For a brief moment, it appeared the badge might shield Malik. Initial investigations were half-hearted, with officers reluctant to delve deeply into the actions of their superior. Malik's status as the sheriff loomed large, and his commanding presence intimidated many who might have questioned him. Enter Detective Isaiah Merritt, a no-nonsense investigator with a reputation for cutting through deception. Merritt, newly transferred from the State Bureau, was a man immune to intimidation. Where others hesitated, Merritt pressed forward, scrutinizing Malik's story with a skeptical eye. "Something doesn't add up," Merritt muttered to his partner, Detective Lisa Morales, as they examined the crime scene. The broken glass at the back door was inconsistent with the angle of entry, and there were no muddy footprints leading into the home, an odd omission for a supposed intruder. Morales, equally unshaken by Malik's status, began conducting discreet interviews with neighbors and colleagues. Several mentioned hearing heated arguments from the Daniels household over the months leading up to the crime. While most were reluctant to speak ill of Malik openly, the whispers began to paint a picture of a troubled marriage. As the investigation deepened, forensic evidence began to unravel Malik's narrative. Blood spatter patterns told a story different from the one Malik had offered. The blow to Soraya's head did not align with a random act of violence by an intruder. Instead, it suggested an up-close and deliberate attack. Bruises on Soraya's arms, consistent with defensive wounds, indicated she had struggled in her final moments. Her injuries told a haunting tale of a desperate attempt to protect herself and her unborn child. Merritt also noticed something odd about the lamp Malik claimed had been knocked over during the supposed altercation with the intruder. It bore traces of Soraya's blood, but none of the intruder's fingerprints Malik had so see. Witness statements further chipped away at Malik's story. A neighbor reported seeing Malik's car parked outside during the hours he claimed to have been away. Another mentioned overhearing Malik raising his voice at Soraya in the weeks prior to her death. But the most damning evidence came from an autopsy report. The forensic team found no signs of forced entry into the house or any struggle with an intruder beyond Soraya's own futile attempts to defend herself. The timeline Malik provided didn't match the estimated time of death, further eroding his credibility. Piece by piece, the investigators assembled the puzzle. What began as a seemingly straightforward burglary gone wrong began to look more like a meticulously planned cover-up. Malik Daniels, the man entrusted with upholding the law, was now the prime suspect in its gross violation. Detective Merritt, reviewing the evidence in his cluttered office, leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the table. "We're not dealing with an intruder," he said grimly. "This was personal. And Malik knows it." Morales nodded, her voice firm. "We need to bring him in." For Malik, the walls were closing in. His carefully constructed story was collapsing under the weight of cold, hard facts, and the investigators were inching closer to uncovering the full truth. The community of Willowcrest was about to learn that the sheriff they trusted had far more to hide than anyone ever imagined. The sheriff's arrest was not an immediate action, but rather a slow unfolding of inevitability. Malik Daniels had been invited for questioning after his wife's body was discovered, and the authorities were careful in their approach. As a fellow law enforcement officer, Malik was not initially treated as a criminal but as a person of interest. His colleagues hesitated, unsure of how to proceed with someone they had once worked alongside, someone who had earned their respect. The initial stages of the investigation saw Malik deny any involvement in his wife's death. At first, Malik sat comfortably in the interrogation room, asserting his innocence with a calmness that seemed out of place given the gravity of the situation. "I didn't do this," he repeated over and over, his voice firm, betraying none of the guilt that would later emerge. His defense was simple: Soraya had been in a violent, heated state before she died, but he had never laid a hand on her. He claimed that their marriage had become toxic, but that didn't mean he had killed her. But as the hours wore on and the detectives pressed, cracks began to appear. The investigation team uncovered forensic evidence that contradicted Malik's version of events. Witness statements, blood spatter analysis, and the testimony of neighbors all painted a clearer picture of the violent altercation that took place that night. Malik's claim of a spontaneous argument turned out to be far more than he could account for. It wasn't long before his defense began to crack under pressure. Aware of the mounting evidence against him, Malik's bravado faltered. He was no longer the proud sheriff, he was a man trapped in a lie. Finally, after hours of intense interrogation, Malik admitted to what he had done. He confessed, breaking down in the face of irrefutable evidence. It wasn't just the forensic details that shattered him, it was the growing realization that no one was going to protect him now. The mask he had worn for so long had slipped, revealing the truth he had tried to bury. His confession, though reluctant, was chilling in its simplicity. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want to hurt her," he said, his voice trembling as he recalled the confrontation. "But I did. I lost control. I thought she was disrespecting me, in front of everyone. I never wanted her dead, but it just happened." The confession sent shockwaves through the community. Malik, once a symbol of authority and respect, was now a convicted murderer in the eyes of his colleagues and neighbors. Malik's arrest sent the town of Willowcrest into a state of disbelief. The sheriff, a man who had served as the face of law enforcement for so many years, was now the subject of intense scrutiny. His colleagues, many of whom had worked under him for years, struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the brutal act he had committed. There were no celebratory cheers, no sense of triumph, only the sickening realization that someone who had wielded so much power had used it to destroy the life of the person closest to him. The trial quickly became the focal point of the community. The courtroom was filled to capacity with residents and curious onlookers. The community was split. Some were vocal in their support, clinging to the idea that a man of Malik's stature could never do such a thing, while others were outraged, feeling betrayed by the very person meant to protect them. The sheriff? "No way," whispered Deborah Jameson, a lifelong resident of Willowcrest, as she clutched a cup of coffee in the town's cafe. "He's always been the man in charge. I can't believe he'd do something like that." But there was another group, those who had been behind closed doors, hearing rumors of Malik's temper and domineering presence. "It doesn't surprise me at all," said Tom Henderson, a former officer who had worked alongside Malik years ago. "He always had a way of making people scared of him. But he was good at hiding it." As the days passed, the town became divided, with some continuing to stand by Malik, while others believed justice was long overdue. What had once been a close-knit community now found itself at odds, each side torn between loyalty and betrayal, struggling to make sense of a tragedy that had left everyone reeling. The prosecution, armed with a mountain of evidence, wasted no time in making their case. Detective Isaiah Merritt took the stand, recounting the findings from the crime scene. The blood spatter analysis, the bruises on Soraya's body, and the sequence of events that led to her death were all meticulously detailed. But the most devastating evidence came from the confession. Malik's own words, his admission of guilt, were undeniable. As the prosecution presented their case, Malik's defense struggled to regain control. His lawyer, Paul Riley, tried to paint a picture of a man broken by his circumstances, a man who had been a good sheriff and a devoted husband until a series of unfortunate events shattered his life. Riley's argument seemed weak, and his attempts to humanize Malik felt hollow, especially when compared to the starkness of the evidence. Soraya's family, particularly her sister Mariah, gave emotional testimony about the woman they had lost. Mariah spoke of Soraya's fear of Malik, recalling the bruises that had appeared in the months leading up to her death. "She told me he was getting worse. She was afraid of what he might do," Mariah said, her voice choked with emotion. Malik sat motionless during the trial, his face pale and drawn. Gone was the confident sheriff who had once commanded respect, now he was a man awaiting the consequences of his actions. His supporters, who had filled the courtroom at the start, were now noticeably absent, the weight of the truth too much for them to bear. The prosecution's case was airtight. The key witness was Malik himself. His confession, though reluctant, provided all the proof they needed. Malik had admitted to the killing, and the details of the crime painted a chilling picture. He had lashed out in a fit of rage, unable to accept his wife's criticism, unable to control his overwhelming sense of humiliation in front of his colleagues. The prosecution outlined the details of the crime scene, presenting forensic evidence that was as damning as it was comprehensive. Soraya's injuries were consistent with a violent confrontation, and the blood spatter analysis confirmed that she had been struck multiple times in a fit of uncontrolled rage. The prosecution's most damning piece of evidence came from a voicemail left by Soraya just days before her death. In it, she described a heated argument between her and Malik, one where he threatened her. "He said he would ruin me if I ever tried to leave him," Soraya's trembling voice echoed in the courtroom as the recording played. The voicemail was a cry for help, the prosecutor, Sarah Levins, said, her voice firm. "It's clear from the evidence that Malik had been abusing his wife, physically and emotionally, for months before her tragic death. It didn't stop there." She outlined Malik's motive, his ego, his thirst for control, and his inability to accept any challenge to his authority. It painted a portrait of a man driven by anger and consumed by a need to dominate every aspect of his life. The prosecution ended with one simple question: how many more women had to suffer at his hands before he was held accountable? The prosecution's closing argument was simple and powerful. "This was not an accident," Sarah Levin said, her voice firm. "This was a calculated act of violence carried out by a man who could not accept being disrespected. Malik Daniels is not the man we thought he was. He is a murderer." The defense tried to argue that Malik had not intended to kill his wife, but rather had acted in the heat of the moment. Paul Riley claimed that Malik was under immense pressure at work and at home. He tried to paint Malik as a victim of circumstance, a man who had snapped under the weight of his responsibilities and was overwhelmed by the stress of his failing marriage. "We're not saying that what Malik did was right," Riley conceded, "but what we are saying is that he didn't mean to kill her. This was a moment of intense frustration, one where his temper got the better of him. He didn't plan to take her life. It was a tragic accident." But the jury was unmoved. They had seen the evidence. They had heard the testimony. Malik had confessed to the crime, and no amount of pleading from his defense could change the brutal truth of what had happened. When the verdict came, it was clear. The jury found Malik Daniels guilty of second-degree murder. There was no doubt in their minds that he had intentionally taken his wife's life, driven by a toxic mix of ego, anger, and control. As the judge pronounced the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of emotions. Soraya's family wept in relief, knowing that justice had been served, but their grief was still raw. Malik, on the other hand, sat motionless, his eyes vacant, as the reality of his fate settled in. He had once held the power to control the lives of others, but now he was at the mercy of the system he had once served. Outside the courthouse, Willowcrest was forever changed. The sheriff's office would have to rebuild its reputation, and the community would never be the same. Malik Daniels' fall from grace was a stark reminder that no one is beyond the reach of justice, no matter how high they rise or how deeply they try to bury their sins. The town of Willowcrest was never the same after Malik Daniels' arrest. What had once been a tight-knit community, where law enforcement was seen as a pillar of safety and justice, quickly descended into a sea of skepticism and fear. Residents who had once trusted their sheriff to protect them now found themselves questioning everything they knew about the man who had been the face of their law enforcement for years. People began to wonder, how could someone so trusted, so respected, fall so far? Community events that had once been well attended, where Malik stood proudly in his uniform, now felt uncomfortable. People began to distance themselves from the sheriff's office, fearing it was no longer a symbol of safety, but one of corruption and shame. The town's reaction to his fall from grace was a mixture of disbelief and anger. The trust he had built over his years of service was obliterated in an instant. The once celebrated sheriff's office was now tainted, and his former colleagues, some of whom had worked beside him for decades, were forced to come to terms with the fact that they had been blind to his darker side. Malik's fall from grace serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power. As a sheriff, Malik had ultimate authority within his community. He could arrest, interrogate, and exercise control over people's lives. However, over time, that power seemed to corrupt him. His actions reflect how power, when left unchecked, can erode one's empathy and judgment. The very thing he swore to protect, justice, was the very thing he betrayed. The red flags were always there. Malik's anger, his need to be seen as superior, and the power dynamics at play in his marriage were ignored, or downplayed, by those around him. Colleagues dismissed signs of tension in his personal life, and even his wife's complaints were brushed off. This was a man who had become so accustomed to controlling every situation that he could not fathom being disrespected, and the consequences were tragic. The story of Malik and Soraya should serve as a wake-up call. It's a reminder that domestic violence is a pervasive issue that can happen in any relationship, and that power dynamics can fuel an abuser's behavior. The psychological toll of abuse is often invisible, and victims are often afraid to speak out. We must create an environment where victims feel safe to speak up, especially when those in power are the perpetrators. Only through awareness and support can we hope to prevent tragedies like this from happening again. We must ask ourselves, what can we do to prevent such tragedies? How can we hold those in power accountable before they make a fatal mistake? What measures can we take to protect those who feel powerless, who are too afraid to speak out against the ones they love? The case of Malik Daniels forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of power and the devastating consequences of its abuse. We urge you to discuss this case. Talk about the dangers of domestic violence, especially among those in power. Share the story of Soraya and remind others that justice must never be silenced. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, seek help. Speak out. There is no shame in asking for support. Please subscribe, and let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. What are your thoughts on Malik's actions? How can we better protect those who are vulnerable? Your opinions are important, and together, we can make a difference. When power becomes unchecked, even the most sacred bonds can be broken. Remember her story, because justice must never be silenced. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more.